Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. There are few words in the military world more feared and more stigmatized than that of mutiny, a crime of the highest order, a destabilizer, an act that at its worst can spread like a contagion and leave a nation at the mercy of its enemies. For 200 years, historians have flirted around the edges of mutinies, acknowledging their danger, recognizing their significance, but rarely delving deeply, except perhaps in the case of the India Mutiny of 1857, itself an event that is poorly understood and deeply mythologized. So, what constituted a mutiny? Are they as simple as workers' strikes? Did they actually work? And more than anything else, why do they matter? Joining me for a back and forth on this is Callum Easton, social, economic, and maritime historian of the 18th and 19th century, particularly with a focus on Britain and the British maritime world. He's the 2025 winner of the Sir Julian Cobbett Prize in Modern Naval History, and he's the author of a critically acclaimed and hotly anticipated work, The 1797 Naval Mutinies and Popular Protest in Britain, Negotiation Through Collective Action, which is available now from Palgrave Macmillan. To give you an idea of how well received that is, I've just extracted two quotes from the dust cover, which say, truly original and convincing, and the study we've been waiting for. So if that doesn't tempt you to go and buy it, then frankly, folks, I don't know what will. Callum, welcome back. It's great to see you again. How are things?
Thank you, Zach. Yes, great to join you, and thank you. My ears are burning after that. Thank you. But yeah, always great to come in and chat about this juicy topic of mutiny.
We're going to start with the fundamentals. The
Mm.
definition, what is a mutiny? I have opinions. One thing that I'm just going
Mm.
to hurl into the chat straight away is that I was reading a work recently that essentially said a mutiny can, by by its very nature, has to be a multi-person act. So maybe we'll
Mm.
push that out there
Yeah.
as a point for discussion. Can an individual mutiny, or does it need to be a, a is it a plurality thing? Do you need multiple mutineers for it
Mm.
to be a mutiny? And if it's a solo act, is it sort of mutinous conduct or insubordination? What are your thoughts on that? And also more broadly, where is the line? How do you cross from being insolent and awkward and lazy into downright mutinous?
Well, this cuts to the heart of the matter straight away. I think that my short answer is it's a very broad definition. It changes over time, and there's a huge amount of discretion in there, particularly on the part of the officers. So I'm sure you've seen similar in military history and military justice. But to give a broad definition, I would say it would have to be as broad as saying events perceived by officers to harm or run counter to the usual discipline. And in saying that, I'm not trying to privilege the officer's viewpoint over all others. I'm just trying to make the point that in this judicial military system, ultimately it was the officers who decided what was and wasn't mutiny. And often sailors accused of mutiny, put on trial for mutiny, would have been pretty horrified at that characterization of their behavior and events. So, in terms of that sense of discretion, captains had at their disposal two kinds of justice, similar, I think, to what you see in regimental contexts. First, you have summary justice, where on their ship, a captain's rule is law. They can decide to have someone flogged, 24 lashes, and that's the end of it. Or they have the option to escalate this to a full court martial. And that is when they get to decide this is mutiny. I'm calling in my fellow captains and we'll try this very severely. In terms of the question of whether individuals can mutiny, this again basically comes down to a captain's discretion. I think the most classic form of mutiny, what we tend to imagine and think of when we hear the word mutiny, is very much a collective act, a collective form of protest. But because the term was so loosely applied, so much at the mercy of the officers, you do sometimes see it applied to individuals. And as you intimated earlier on, we do get this overlap with offences like insubordination, insolence, disobedience, disrespectful behaviour, striking a superior. And some of these acts can be and have been individual acts and have been tried nonetheless. Um, so I suppose my last point on that would be that historians themselves and sociologists too have then come along and muddied the waters quite a lot after the event and applied their own definitions to mutiny. And I think we'll probably come across several in the course of our discussion. But that can be useful, it can be valid, but we have to try where possible, I think, to get back to the term as it was understood and as it was applied by people at the time.
Yeah, I think you raised some key points, and everything that you said there vis-a-vis the naval system and what you kind of picked out as similarities to the land forces system. You know, you're absolutely right on all of those points. The role of the arresting officer can be
Mm,
absolutely crucial here. Um, Now, there is perhaps a role to be played by the NCOs in the sense of they can also, I mean, everybody's meant to be active in quelling a
right.
mutiny, right? You know, that is an
Mm.
explicit offence in
Yes, not to
certainly.
do your utmost to
Mm,
quell a mutiny, absolutely.
yeah, I mean, I believe it's stated in the original Mutiny Act as well as being in what for the army side of things is the Articles of War,
Mm,
the Articles for the better management of His Majesty's forces, and that ends up meaning that the officers themselves have a huge amount of discretion
yeah.
on this. And apologies, regular listeners. Yes, I'm mounting my regular hobby horse in terms of pragmatism and discretion
Mm,
and the nature of justice during this period. But this is how justice works. Sometimes
yeah,
people
rough
turn
and ready.
around and clobber an individual with the full force of the law. And other times they turn around and say, actually, no, maybe we won't do that. Maybe we'll be a little bit more discretionary, hence the
Mm,
term. Um, so I think there are some really interesting gray areas. What I often spend a lot of time musing on is the fact that we have this term mutinous conduct as
yeah.
a charge, which is actually far more common within the British King's Army as a
Ooh,
form of charge than actually full blown mutiny. The British Army, the King's Army, doesn't really have big mutiny cases, unlike, and we'll get to this, unlike the Royal Navy during this period,
right.
vis-a-vis your work on Spithead and Nor. Um, and with an eye on that, I think therefore a lot of the focus tends to have shifted predominantly and wrongly towards the Navy. And that's not to say that the Navy doesn't matter. The Navy does matter hugely because the Spithead and Nor mutinies are crisis moments and they're perceived as
Mm,
such by everybody. But in the process, what everybody's done is sort of gone Spithead and Nor 1797, and then Indian Mutiny 1857. And, you know, so you've got these two bookends, and then there's sort of this lull in the middle. And I think what gets missed is that within the East India Company,
mm,
this mutiny is not only is it an not only is it an unending fear, it's also an endemic problem because you have a sequence of much smaller scale mutinies. The Vellore Mutiny, for example, is a much bigger scale event, but there are others that punctuate. At one point in the 1820s, the officer class mutinies. None of this gets anywhere near the level of attention that it deserves. Um, so I think you raised some really important points here in terms of the perspective on this,
mm.
because the idea of charging an officer for mutiny, can you imagine the scandal that would
Pandora's
ensue?
box.
I mean, that court martial would take about 1 billion years to resolve the length of the defences on trying to sort of argue down that charge. Um, I'm also always very interested by the idea of threatening an officer, and this is what I always kind of refer to
Mm,
as the euphemistic charge phenomenon. Because if you threaten an officer with violence in the army, quite often they will say that you threaten to strike an officer, or you threaten to bayonet an officer, or even you threaten to shoot an officer. They don't say mutinous conduct. And I find that so
right.
interesting because if you're threatening to shoot your officer, that does rather smack of
That's
mutiny. which therefore leads me to question, is mutiny something perhaps slightly softer? Because, or at least within the naval context, because my admittedly limited understanding of the naval mutinies is that they tend and try to be quite respectful in their tone. Now we'll put a sort of a pin in that and come back to what happens with the Indian mutinies. But I'm just curious
Mm,
about whether you feel that sort of the threat of violence to an officer in some circles is kind of seen as disadvantageous from a mutineer's perspective because actually they're trying to secure some concessions, and whether being polite and genteel and trying to minimize the threat ends up becoming part of the DNA of the mutiny in order to not make the mutiny look quite like a mutiny.
yes, I suppose one point I would raise there is after the fact, it's never really in anyone's best interest to admit that a mutiny has taken place, because obviously those involved would be keen to avoid judicial punishment, but even the officers involved would be quite keen to minimize or play down the importance of this breach of rule that has taken place on their watch, because ultimately a mutiny in any form is a failure. It's a breakdown of a system. And so if you're at the top of that system, it's going to be very embarrassing that that's taken place. Um, but I really like the argument you were making there in terms of seeing mutiny as a form of negotiation. I think that's hugely important. I would tend to characterize it as the failure of one kind of day-to-day negotiation and the start of another, potentially more confrontational, more high-risk strategy of negotiation. Um, and yes, within the naval context, we have a very broad spectrum of mutiny there, from a very small number where there is a lot of violence. A famous example would be the Hermione mutiny, where the rather vicious captain and most of the officers are butchered in cold blood, basically, and thrown overboard. Um, that's a bit of an outlier, fortunately, but it is an important one to admit that that did take place. That is on the spectrum. But as you say, the majority of mutinies, people are aiming to achieve specific goals. And I think there is always an awareness, certainly in the shipboard setting, that no mutiny can last forever. Sooner or later, this will have to come to an end one way or the other, and you're going to have to be able to make peace with the powers that be, who will eventually reimpose their will. And within the strategy of a complex negotiation, sometimes it pays dividends to play hardball for a day or two. Sometimes it's better to be conciliatory. You can oscillate from one to the other a little bit, but by and large, it is best to avoid creating a head-on situation where you make compromise and meaningful negotiation impossible. You have to kind of still operate within the system that you're trying to reform, I suppose. So in that sense, I absolutely agree that by and large, they are relatively peaceful, relatively respectful.
Do they get overhyped? There's a big
Mm,
question in that. And I'm thinking about this from multiple perspectives. You know, are mutinies something that you spend a lot of time fearing, but actually only come around once in a blue moon? No, in the India case, I would argue not. I would actually argue that the fear is legitimate, and it's all really sort of tied up with what what actually is a pretty rum deal for
mm,
the sepoys. Now, within you could very easily make frankly a quite facile point. Well, that's obviously the case with the Spithead and Nor mutinies. You know, the issues with pay and all the rest of it. You can say more on that than I certainly can. Um, but do you see these as punctuation marks? Are they sort of exclamation marks within the course of an ongoing discussion about what is essentially labor rights, but with the stakes massively raised? Because if there's a strike amongst your soldiers or your sailors, suddenly, as I alluded to in the intro, you are vulnerable to
mm.
the aggression of other nations. Or are they kind of part of a back and forth? Are they sort of perhaps more like commas in this sort of an ongoing conversation? How do you see them? Oh, apologies for the warped punctuation analogy, but hopefully you can
No,
kind of get where I'm going with
just
it in
about
terms
following.
of how big how big a deal are these versus how
Mm.
much they are feared, and how much um, is that fear actually used as a tactic by the powers that be in an effort to quell mutinies?
Ah, yes. Well, again, I have to fall back on the rather mealy-mouthed, lawyery response that a lot changed over time, I think, in this respect. Um, so I would argue that up to the 1790s, up to these big mutinies at Spithead and the Nore, I think mutiny was, well, semi-routine, though I sort of hesitate to use that term to an extent, um, in the sense that most professional naval officers could expect to encounter several mutinies in the course of their career, whether directly against them as the captain of a ship or when they were a more junior officer witnessing these events. But also the fact of courts martial trying people for mutiny after the effect. Captains would have to serve on the judging panel of these trials. So to an extent, there was something of a regularity to encountering different kinds of mutiny, different aspects of mutiny, and having to respond to them. And as I say, in most cases, mutiny was a bit of a last resort because it suggests that less high stakes attempts at negotiation had already failed, had already been ignored by the powers that be. But they were happening fairly regularly. But when we get to the late 1790s, I think then we move, if you like, from your comma to your exclamation mark, because of the high stakes of these mutinies. I think they did take the government certainly by surprise. They took the Navy as an institution by surprise. There was an element of perhaps complacency about how the sailors would behave, these loyal and true Jack-Tars. Um, so the scale of the organization, the effectiveness of the sailors at working together on that scale and holding out for what they considered to be their rights and their best interests, I think that really terrified the government at the time. And you can understand why, as you mentioned, when there is a credible threat of invasion at seemingly any day, you have your two main fleets responsible for protecting the British Isles, each are mutinying for a month. That's a really terrifying situation. It's not a perfect comparison, but it's a bit like fighter pilots going on strike in the summer of 1940. I think that's how we need to think about the emotional response that it created in the British public as a whole. But because of that collective and institutional trauma, as you say, I think they did try to, the authorities did to an extent try to harness that in their rather strict response to the mutinies, particularly the second mutiny, the Nore mutiny. I think there were 10 ringleaders identified on each ship involved, and they intended to put them all on trial, potentially for their life. In the end, they wound that up a bit earlier than that, but there were still 28 executions as a result of the Nore mutiny. And what we see with this shift in the definition of mutiny in this time is that a lot of naval officers seem to have been jumping at shadows after that. Even if we ignore these two big mutinies themselves, the statistics for the number of men put on trial for mutiny in the next 5 years go through the roof because there is this sense of paranoia in a way. And we see men who previously would have been put on trial for insubordination or disrespect. Suddenly it's mutiny that they're facing. And to an extent, after 18 months, the courts themselves seem to cotton on to this and start giving out fewer death sentences, fortunately, which brings things back into more orderly, normal, a more normal state of affairs. But the officers themselves are still bringing many more men to trial for mutiny than they had just a few years earlier. So it does leave this somewhat bitter legacy. You see officers with this threat looming over them a little bit more.
That's so interesting. And again, it speaks to one of the points that we made right at the start, doesn't it? About the influence of the arresting officer on
Mm.
the journey that an individual will go through um, when they go to trial. I just brought some stats to this because
Oh, yes.
I love to.
Good.
So I have 136 individuals charged with mutiny. I have 200 individuals charged with mutinous conduct, or their
Mm.
charge in some way made reference to mutinous behavior. That's out of 9,228. So straight up
Right.
mutiny charged in 1.5% of cases, and some level of mutinous behavior in 200 out of those 9,000 odd. So that's 2.2% of cases.
Mm.
So it's by no
Yeah, very
means,
minor, yes.
yeah, it's not common. If you compare that to desertion statistics,
Right.
desertion is something like
Yeah,
40,
different league.
50% of all trials. So can desertion be a mutiny? Because they are both withdrawal of labor, and this taps into a much bigger way of thinking about it. It's become quite sort of in vogue, I think, for quite right reasons, for historians to look at um, the relationship between the soldier and the state, or the soldier and the officers, as one that is fundamentally a business relationship, albeit with
Mm.
the stakes massively elevated. And you can see the logic behind that because these guys are employees of the British government, of the king specifically, and the king can sign off on your execution if you don't do what you're told. So it's a bit of an odd relationship. It's a
Yes,
dangerous
very
relationship to
severe.
say the least. So, is it fair to talk about mutinies solely within a sort of economic context and through what historians would
Mm.
term the economic lens, in terms of like this is a contract and you are an employee, and military law is fundamentally sort of employment law, but with big big
Right.
consequences if you don't stick to it? Or is there much more to this at play, particularly when you consider the relationship amongst soldiers, sailors, and indeed mutineers? And this is, I know, one of the sort of hot topics that you're an expert in terms of where does society and social relations sit within that much bigger picture of mutiny as a fight between two power bases, your employee and your
Mm.
employer? How do you bring all of those together, from an army side of things, particularly from an EIC, East India Company side of
Mm.
things? Um, I am very, very much of the mind that, if anything, the financial side of things is far more integral to how sepoys view their role within the East India Company Army than it is for the King's Army. And that's not to say that it's not there
Right.
in the regular army, because it is. And we know that because we see desertion spikes when the terms of that employment are changed, when the British government
Mm.
summarily extends the enlistment period from 7 years to you're staying for as long as we say that there's a war on, and you will accept it. And at that point, you see a spike in desertions. You also see a spike in desertions at the end of the war, where people don't stick around and wait for their discharge. They go, well, I'm done. I've done my duty. I'm
Mm.
off. You broke your contract. I'm going to go and attend to things myself. So I'm not saying that it's not there, because it absolutely is. For the sepoy, though, um, there is an acute awareness on both sides of this, both amongst sepoys, but also amongst the white officer class, that they are engaged in a labor market. These sepoys,
Mm.
if they want to, they can go and get employment with one of the other princes who is ruling a different part of India. There is that option. And folks who listen to this show may recall an episode where I talked about this incredible document that I am working up into an article, folks. At which point I will then be able to say much more about its contents. But it is layered time and time again about things like erosions of privileges,
Mm.
um, issues with the fact that the rewards aren't really worth it. But then it's also layered with concerns about status. So it talks about, in fact, at one point, it suggests that prostitutes are of a higher social standing than sepoys
Mm.
these days, because of how the the stigma that's been attached to sepoys and the way that they've been treated has just kind of degraded the social standing of the sepoy
Mm,
in society. There's also a lot of calling out of institutionalized racism, which when you put all of this together, you then start to realize, well, sure, you've got the Valois Mutiny, sure, you've got the 1857 mutiny, but actually, this is part of an ongoing conversation where it's not just about the money and it's not
mm.
just about breaches of contract and awareness that, well, you've breached your contract. So therefore, I'm going to, put my musket down and refuse to do what you say. And it becomes about um, much more. There is more at stake, which apologies is a bit of a waffle. It's kind of tan- tangented off from the original kind of
Makes a lot
thrust
of
of where I was
sense.
going with this. But what do you make of and what do you see amongst mutineers, their aims, and also the relationships that are going on here amongst mutineers, but also amongst colleagues who haven't mutinied? How does it all kind of
Mm.
mesh together?
Yes. Well, these are deep, complex questions. Ooh. I think, again, one thing I would start off by saying is I'm not a physicist. I don't want to get lost in the woods of my own ignorance, but it sometimes really helps me to think about this kind of thing in terms of things like inertia, critical mass, and momentum. Because when we're thinking about collective views and collective identity and decision making. Often, if an object is stationary, it takes a great deal of effort to get it moving, but once it's moving, it can acquire that momentum. And I think there's something similar at play with large groups of people, um, because well, it can be quite difficult to get a large population worked up to an extent that they will take very risky actions like mutiny, because to some extent, mutiny is always going to be an irrational choice in terms of the stakes, as you say, that are at play there. So for me, there has to be an emotional decision, I think, more than a logical one to initiate a mutiny. So going back to sort of the start of your question, this kind of economic side of things, yes, I think certainly undoubtedly there's this transactional side to the life of a soldier or a sailor. And that comes with expectations on them, and in return, they are quite clear about what they expect back from the state. Um, but what I tended to find looking at the mutinies of the sailors in these particular cases was that they certainly felt as though they were being neglected, as though the terms of this unwritten contract with the state had been breached. But I think it was more the emotional response of anger and fury and unfairness at the breach of contract rather than the state of the terms of service themselves that upset them. So yes, just to try and give you some concrete illustrations of that. Yes, the sailors complained about their pay rate, um, but they weren't starving by any means. They were actually not too much affected by wages because they were so rarely paid anyway, and so rarely had a chance to spend their wages. I think it was more the emotional fury that the army had received a pay rise 2 years earlier. The naval lieutenants had received a pay rise the year before, and naval captains were about to receive a pay rise as well. I think it's that emotional sense of anger at being overlooked, at being neglected, it's that incensed emotion that is able to mobilize groups of people, move that stationary object, and build up a bit of momentum. I think that's when we see a real risk of mutinies breaking out. And I can't help but think in similar terms today, when we see industrial action and strikes, but most of the news coverage tends to focus on pay rates and things. But so often the sticking points are actually matters of pride, matters of self-perception, uh, feeling seen and understood, feeling a sense of self-worth. And I think we can sort of project that back into the past as well with some confidence. Actually, if I could throw a question back there, I know
Sure.
you can't, you don't want to go into, quite rightly, you're keeping your cards close to your chest on this great document. But in terms of the language that's used in their complaints, do we see kind of a mix of conciliatory language? Are they quite respectful, or are there uh, sort of veiled threats in there, or are they using some of the language of the era of rights and political expectations, that kind of thing?
The language, this is what's really struck me about it. And this is why I'm so
Mm.
interested in your book and your work around this, because
Oh, right.
the language is anything but conciliatory. It is
Right.
so angry, so violent. The
Ooh.
threats aren't even veiled, they
Right.
are overt, and they speak about sort of the unity of the sepoys and make references to things like, we know that you've sent out sort of five or so regiments. Well, good. But actually, if the moment comes when we decide to really make a sticking point of this, it doesn't matter if you send out 20 regiments, the sepoys will be
Mm.
united and there's nothing you can do.
Ooh.
The language is sort of, um, I might in fact term or call the article something like Valor Morgulis in reference to the Game of Thrones line, all men must die, because there is a
Mm.
line in there about everybody dies at some point. And do you really want to play this game with us? Do you really
Ooh.
want to risk everything that is built upon our compliance and our goodwill and our engagement and facilitation that enables you
Mm.
to rule this country? And it completely blows apart how we've thought about sepoys up until this point. There's been very much this debate about to what extent are sepoys, because they choose employment with a British company, are they supporters of British intentions in India? No. Um, are they acquiescent? Are they sort of feathering their own nest? Are they just blown away by the aura of Britain and its ability with artillery? There's a lot of sort of imperialistic association and a lot
Right.
of imperialistic interpretations about how people have construed the sepoy that have then bled through into these lingering perceptions about what the sepoy is like. And actually, what this document does, written by a sepoy, purporting to be written in consultation, I don't think it was written in consultation. I think it's a guy sounding off, but probably sounding off with a few of his mates.
Mm.
Um, and effectively turning around and saying, we know that you need us. So actually, we're going to use that to our advantage.
Mm.
And in terms of these big things around negotiated authority, which is another one of those very sort of hot phrases within discussion of the armed forces and the power dynamics, it says a huge amount about just how negotiated that authority is,
Yeah.
because in some respects it shows that authority is a bit of an illusion,
Mm.
not entirely an illusion, because when it comes to the quelling of sepoy mutinies, ultimately the authority of the officer extends from the barrel of a cannon, which is the tool of choice when it comes to execution of sepoys. Um, so there is authority, provided that there are the other resources at the disposal of the officer in order to clamp down.
Yeah.
And you see this very knee jerk response in terms of the exercise of that authority, particularly at the Valour Mutiny, where they execute the wrong guys. It's one of the most
Oh,
astonishing
right.
things that nobody's ever picked up about the Valour Mutiny, is that they execute a bunch of guys from one of the two battalions, and spare some individuals, in fact, because they say, no, 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 I'm not part of that regiment. I'm part of this one. And they go, oh, well, we were about to sort of put you in with I believe it's the 26th. We were about to put you in with those guys and stand you in front of a cannon. Well, you just go and stand over there and we'll put you on trial later. But then put these
Mm.
guys from, I think it's the first regiment, on trial. And then they realize, oh, you, the first regiment, were the instigators. You're the ones who we should have made the example of summary justice with. Um, so there's a lot of kind of, I need to demonstrate my authority in a big,
Yeah.
inverted commas, macho, very sort of domineering manner, which is bred out of an awareness of what
Of
the,
weakness.
yeah, exactly, what the sepoys themselves are saying in this document. Look, we have the numbers. And if we
Mm.
unify around these principles, you are screwed. And the white officer class knows that. They've always known that.
And I think in a way this is an interesting area where mutiny somewhat overlaps, but also diverges from popular protest in the civilian environment, which has been obviously a really popular topic of historical scholarship for decades now. But just that sense of having a bit of space, a bit of time, and a lot of leverage makes this kind of uh, protest in the form of a military mutiny so much more difficult for the state, for the powers that be to deal with, because they're able to negotiate on much closer to equal terms in a way. And the very fact of negotiating at all threatens to undermine, as you say, this kind of illusion of authority, this the smoke and mirrors of consent on which day-to-day rule and exercise of authority is based. As soon as the state, the powers have to kind of get down in the mud with everyone else, look them square in the face and negotiate on close to equal terms, you start to worry if military discipline will ever survive. Will it be able to be reimposed afterwards, or will the spell be broken forever? So I think that that's part of the, again, part of the emotional side that makes mutiny so difficult to deal with from the side of the authorities as well as the soldiers, but gives the military personnel mutinying a sense of opportunity as well that civilian rioters never had or rarely had.
Well, this is part of the challenge that is always inherent in the military system, right? The military is by extension hierarchical, and sure, folks will turn
Mm,
around and say, well, in business there are hierarchical structures, and sure, there absolutely are.
yeah.
Um, but very rarely are people sort of running around wielding sharp stabby things or
Mm,
bangy gun things that can sort of
yeah.
go off in either direction should sort of tensions boil over a little bit too much. And in a situation where you have military law which is designed to effectively impose and maintain that hierarchical structure, anything that allows that system to sort of get mushy at the edges is really quite dangerous. But the flip side is that you're dealing with humans, and human behavior has to be integral to how you think about this, because these people aren't automatons. And
Mm,
if you look, for example, at how people have traditionally spoken about the Prussian army, there is this sort of assumption that these people are almost like robots, and they're more scared of their officers than they are of the enemy. These sort of ideas that just do not hold together if you actually stop and think about what human beings are like, which is why I raised this question about the sort of the psychology, the sociological
mm.
elements of all of this, because Ed Koss enters the discussion at
Ah,
this point, doesn't he? With his work on um, why soldiers fight, which in itself is an extension of the work of people like Marshall, and discussions about models of military motivation, um, because you can't terrorize an individual into risking their lives. So if
mm.
your disciplinary system is too brutal, then people will turn around and mutiny. They will bite, they will refuse, or they will turn these weapons that you've trained them to use on you, the individual trying to impose that system.
Yeah.
Which begs the question about why we've created this perception that this is a one directional process, which it's as pervasive for military law as it is for the discussions around mutiny and workers' rights and all the rest of it. There is this very sort of top down perception.
Mm.
The person at the top says, and the people at the bottom simply ask how high the general, the captain, the whoever requires them to jump. And yet we've missed the point entirely that human beings will turn around and go, no, absolutely not. One example that really springs to mind here is William Tatum's work. He did a chapter for a volume by Kevin Lynch and Matt McCormack, where he talked about negotiated authority, particularly
Mm.
with an example where a bunch of guys were told to embark on a ship for enlistment for service overseas, and they turned around and said, "Well, our terms of enlistment say that we're not going to serve overseas. So, respectfully, sir, absolutely the heck not are we getting on board these vessels." So, you go figure. And there's this really kind of interesting debate to be had about, is that mutiny? Is that negotiation because the officers ultimately back down? Or is it that the men know their rights, and the reason that the officers back down isn't because they're concerned about mutiny so much as the fact that if this goes to trial, they will be exposed for the fact that they've tried to get these men to break their terms of enlistment. What they have done is unlawful, and if that gets exposed, these officers would themselves appear on trial. It's a very complex web.
Mm.
Now, I fall down much more on the line of, this is about an acknowledgement and a recognition of rights, and what I'm trying to do is unlawful, so therefore I'm going to back the heck up for reasons of self-preservation. Now William sort of comes down on the opposite side and sort of sees this much
Mm.
more as negotiation of authority, which takes us full circle, I guess, back to what
Yes,
we said, doesn't it?
certainly
In terms
interrelated.
of this sense that where is that line between the two? But let's hone in on the psychology of this.
Mm. Yes.
The risks are huge. When you turn
No,
around and tell an officer to do one, regardless of how politely you do it, there is a risk of death. The
mm.
Articles of War and the Mutiny Act are incredibly clear on this. The individual shall suffer death um, if they are found guilty of mutiny. Now, a lot of the other sections of the Articles of War are caveated. All such other
Right.
punishment as a general court martial shall deem fit to award, or however the phrasing lies. From what I remember, the Mutiny Act, there's no room for maneuver.
No, it's
So
a pretty blunt instrument. Yeah.
it is. Um, so psychologically, this is a huge step to do
Yeah.
that, which begs two questions. One is whether or not the individuals are conscious that they are committing a mutinous act at the point at which they're turning around and saying, respectfully, sir, no.
Mm.
And secondly, if they are aware of it, to what extent are they kind of adopting a slightly messianical approach of, I'm going to make this sacrifice, I'm going to throw myself on the bonfire that might be the military justice system in the hope of better things for all of us? And to what extent do they go into this with their eyes wide open, in the sense of,
Mm.
we're going to make a stand here, but our first request, our first demand has to be amnesty for anybody who participates? What's your thought on all of that?
Yeah, this is something I've wrestled with quite a bit in the naval context, certainly. And yeah, I think looking at the precedents in the Navy, what we tend to see is that those most active in the mutiny, those later identified as ringleaders, tend to come from the most experienced group of sailors, the most skillful group of sailors. And that would lead me to suspect that they did have a pretty decent sense of what they were doing in terms of being able to couch their demands and their dialogue in the long traditions of the service, in the good relations and mutual respect that they have with their officers, in the context of this floating community where the survival of everyone depends on everyone else. And it's also, of course, these individuals, the skillful individuals, who can command the loyalty and respect of the rest of their shipmates and persuade that critical mass that I spoke about earlier of opinion round to their side. So at that initial moment of the outbreak of mutiny, I think those leaders were pretty clear of what they were doing and the stakes that were at hand as a result. But for me, what becomes more interesting in a way is how that sense of unity is sustained across a mutiny. Because in a split second of anger, and we talked about the emotional element earlier of feeling wronged and feeling furious about that, in that context, you can imagine a lot of people standing up for their rights and being furious. But then what happens 24 hours later, a week later? How do you maintain that cause, knowing that the moment you drop it, the coercive power of the state will be on top of you? And I find that particularly interesting because it all depends on solidarity. To an extent, it all depends on persuasion, on persuasion. And in the naval context, there was a pretty clear precedent that everyone involved would be aware of, which is when there is a large scale mutiny on a ship or multiple ships, at the end of it, it's only ever going to be a small minority of people who will be punished for it. Because it's in no one's interest to, hang 700 men from a first-rate man of war. That's going to be very unproductive in a war situation. And actually, as a bit of an aside, I read that in the Swedish Navy, they had provision in their military legal code for decimation in the Roman sense of executing 1 in 10. But I haven't come across any examples of that actually being used, presumably again for the same reason that it's a very bad idea if you're trying to fight a war. Um, but from the perspective of ringleaders, if you know you've made yourself prominent in this, it's your neck on the line. And if you lose the support of the rest of your shipmates, they can go back to normal, knowing they're very unlikely to be punished at all. And that just leaves you high and dry to be punished, made an example of. So there is that sense of psychology to it, of guessing and second guessing. You're trying to carry your shipmates with you, your confederates with you, but you're the one running the risk. And so maintaining that unity and solidarity, I think there are a few different ways to do it throughout the course of a long, uh, prolonged negotiation like a mutiny. And I think the best way to do it is to maintain a sense of hope, um, to be able to show everyone that some progress is being made, there is a meaningful negotiation happening, we are likely to gain a few concessions and to be pardoned. But the downside is if the negotiations don't seem to be going anywhere, then you end up relying on, to an extent, fear instead, trying to persuade people we're all in trouble, we're all in this together, when they know full well, actually, it's only the ringleaders who will suffer. Um, or an equally dangerous alternative, if no negotiation is taking place, is to keep promising and promising and promising. Try and keep the cause together by promising them the moon. Um, and again, that's a bit of a cul-de-sac, really. It tends to end very poorly for those involved because it creates, instead of a sense of negotiation with the state, it leads to confrontation, this competitive chess match of move and counter move, and then it's only ever really going to be a matter of time, unfortunately. So yes, I think the psychology of being in that position, sticking your head above the parapet, is an underrated element of tracking how these mutinies developed and how they ended. And I, yeah, really encourage more research in those kinds of areas.
Yeah, it is a problem at the core of a mutiny, right? You can't afford for it to leak.
Right.
Um, it's rather like being on a ship at sea. You really
Mm.
can't afford the
Yeah.
leaks because that's where the weaknesses are exposed, and as a result of that, that is something that's going to be exploited.
Mm.
So it's really interesting to hear you sort of talk about that management of the mutiny once it has got off the ground, once you're past that initial anger slash euphoria slash no, we are doing this. I guess the flip side is how do you break a mutiny if you are faced with this? We know from the British examples in India, overwhelming
Mm.
force and the rapid application of force is absolutely key.
Yeah.
See the stories about people dashing off to bring up the battalion guns as the reinforcements are sort of said to be sort of an hour or so away, and officers really sort of straining every sinew to initially sort of hunker down and establish a initial point at which a stronghold, if you like, and try and sort of contain this whilst also sending out the runners and riders to bring almost like a spider's web. You
Yeah.
send off these little sort of messages along the individual strands, and in comes the overwhelming force that is going to devour this mutiny.
Yeah.
That's how the British deal with it out in India. That's part of the reason that it fails when it comes to the 1857 mutiny. The grievances are too
Right.
widespread. The touch paper has been lit and off it goes. It's a powder keg, quite
Yeah.
frankly. That's been the most astonishing thing about the Indy mutiny is that it doesn't happen before 1857,
Mm.
quite frankly. Um, but that's by the by. When it comes to a naval context, you
Ah.
could make a much more, I suppose this is quite a facile comment, isn't it? That in theory, each ship should be self contained. Emphasis on the theory there, because
Mm.
when you're at anchor, I don't know enough about what people are doing day to day
Right.
on board a ship, and whether you sort of get people going for a social from, HMS Conqueror over to the Neptune to just sort of, well,
Yeah.
we're at anchor, we're not doing anything. It's fine. You can go and have a little shindig over there if you want to, and that becomes a cover for discussion about mutiny. I don't know if that happens in the same way, but in theory, these ships should be quite self-contained
Mm.
um, as sort of social units, and you might have a mutiny aboard one ship, but then what is there to say that just because Ajax has gone and mutinied, that Mars is also going to go and mutiny? So
Mm.
talk us through that and how, if you are in charge of trying to quell a mutiny within one or two or three ships within a fleet, you
Mm.
stop the mutiny within the squadron becoming a mutiny across the entire fleet.
Right. Yes. Well, again, yeah, very complex matters there, and yeah, real headache for those responsible. Um, yeah, as you say, ships do to an extent function as independent units, and I mean, also quite a facile comment that they are at one remove. They are separate. It's very difficult to apply quickly the overwhelming coercive power of the state to a ship just because you can't really get at it. So I jotted down a quote I'm quite fond of. There was one military observer at the time of these two big naval mutinies in 1797 who pointed out that even if the whole inhabitants of Britain were soldiers, they are unequal to the task of subduing a single ship of the line, just because you can't get to it. Really, to put down a mutiny on a ship, you need another ship. And ideally, the government and the Admiralty are quite keen to avoid the idea of two British men of war going broadside to broadside and hammering it out between them. And indeed, they do manage to avoid that, fortunately. But to go back in terms of the contagion between ships, um, really, that's one of the amazing and surprising things of about mutiny in this period is that we can see that the sailors, that the lower deck sailors themselves had incredibly developed and sophisticated means of communication between them, because we see time and time again that word of mutiny spreads among the sailors before the officers ever hear word of it. So, for example, mutiny develops late in 1797 and into 1798 down at the Cape of Good Hope, when supply ships arrive, and all of the lower deck sailors have heard about the mutinies back home before the officers have, so they're able to take their own officers by surprise down there in that distant region. So yeah, so the day-to-day operation of ships within a fleet, there was a lot of coming and going, boats, crews, rowing officers over, logbooks being sent, financial records, etc. A lot of dull admin stuff, but there was the opportunity for social calls as well while in port to some extent. So of these two big mutinies, I keep harking on about that the first one at Spithead, just outside Portsmouth, involved the Channel Fleet, which was an established unit. There was quite a lot of stability there. The ships and the crews were used to working together, which obviously facilitated this spread of information and agreement and coordination between them. The second mutiny up at the Nore, at the mouth of the Thames, was a ragtag fleet that was not used to working together, and there it was a lot less smoothly operated. There were a lot more disagreements. You see ships sort of really weighing up their options. Do we want to be part of this mutiny or not? Some of them fleeing and leaving the mutiny midway through. So I think a lot depends on those established networks of how long the fleet has been operating together, how much trust there is between these ships' crews, because ultimately they are independent units, and just because one ship of the fleet feels incensed about something doesn't mean the others necessarily will. Um, so turning now in terms of switching hats and thinking about how to combat a mutiny, again that there's quite a lot of options. As I say, they managed to avoid a full-scale naval battle, kind of British naval civil war, fortunately. What they basically settle on is starving the ships out, because yes, they they are independent units, but they can't stay that way forever. They do need resupply of food and water, and ultimately that is the way to break apart the social cohesion of the mutinous crews, because as I mentioned earlier, there is that inherent divide there where not everyone has to fear punishment. If you're starting to go hungry, you might be incentivized to drop this and go back to normal, knowing you'll be fine. And that I think you see the interests of the crews diverge in that respect. One last point I would make is that occasionally individuals can be important, particularly charismatic, respected officers. So in the case of Admiral Duncan, who was this massive kind of 6'5" beefy Scot, really charismatic admiral, there was the makings of a mutiny on his flagship, the Venerable, out in the North Sea. He took a very active personal role of lifting a perceived troublemaker by the neck and holding him over the side of the ship for a few minutes. And yeah, there was no further trouble on the Venerable for a while after that. So there was the potential for this kind of personal intervention, but yeah, not everyone was cut out for that kind of thing.
I love that. I love that kind of mentality. It's certainly one way to quell a mutiny. Grab
Mm,
somebody by the throat and threaten to drop them in the sea.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm not sure it would go down particularly well with HR, but
No, no, you'd be in
I
trouble.
think had there been an HR back in the 18th century, then we wouldn't be talking about mutinies, would we? Um, there's one really interesting aspect that goes back to something you were talking about early on about the
Mm,
ringleaders and how these are quite often quite experienced people.
yeah.
Where does education come into this? Because thinking about my mutinous document, that's written by somebody.
Mm,
That therefore means that the individual can write because the version that we have is
yeah.
a translation from the original, which I believe is in Hindustani, which therefore, you know, tells us something about who the writer was. Now, there are all kinds of debates, often smeared with kind of the British imperialistic lens, that make it very hard to work out who the ringleaders of mutinies are. And just because somebody's
Mm,
identified as a ringleader doesn't necessarily mean that they were. So that it
yeah.
becomes very hard to pinpoint instigators and um, actual ringleaders within
Right.
the East India context. Now, there would be an assumption on my part that these individuals, they're engaging in this sort of negotiation. You would kind of think that they would be educated. Is that something that's actually borne out by reality, particularly bearing in mind that a lot of the Navy is staffed by press gang, which
Mm,
therefore means that they sort of scoop up people and they can quite easily scoop up highly educated individuals from
right.
coastal towns, imprison them aboard these warships fundamentally, and send them off for a life at sea for a little while. So, do you see education as playing a role in mutiny? And perhaps more interestingly, does the education of the ringleaders have an impact on the success?
Oh, great question. I think I have to be quite careful here because there are historiographically, there are some tripwires here. In that it's obviously not to the same extent of the kind of subaltern studies and the potentially patronizing viewpoint we might get in the case of the Indian subcontinent and British sources. But for a long time, there has been quite a patronizing and dismissive attitude towards British naval sailors on the whole. And for a long time, there have been arguments that the sailors themselves would not have been capable of this kind of coordinated action, and that clearly sailors were simple and loyal and unthinkingly so, and that surely a mutiny of this scale could only be the result of troublemakers coming in from outside, members of the London Corresponding Society or the United Irishmen, that kind of thing. These kind of agent provocateur almost to whip up anger in the sailors by pointing out how badly they're treated, which the poor sailors themselves would never have had the wits to recognize, that kind of thing. Um, but there's been fortunately quite a lot of work pushing back against that kind of thing recently. So there's an excellent book. edited by Wharton Hawkins about sailors' letters and sailors' literacy, which goes a long way to showing how connected they were to events on land and their families back home, how well aware of wider events and current events that they were. There's also a very good book, Tempest by James Davey, which really dives into the connection between the Navy and the political goings on of the revolutionary 1790s. Um, so yes, you mentioned the press gang, and yeah, they would drag in all kinds of people, no doubt. But discussion is also really focused on what were called the Quota Acts from 1795 onwards, where each parish in the country was supposed to send however many men to the Navy each year. And the argument used to run that that dragged in a lot of educated people, frustrated lawyers, school teachers, what used to be called sea lawyers, these legalistic minded people who would stir up trouble and that kind of thing. Um, I don't see that doesn't carry too much weight with me personally, to be honest, because as I say, I think we do see quite clearly the leaders of the mutinies sign their names quite freely to petitions and lists of demands and things quite proudly. And a lot of work has been done to study these men, and we've found that most of them have spent long careers at sea, mostly in the Navy. They occupy positions of great responsibility and skill. Um, there is some suggestion that people were brought in by the leading mutineers to act as scribes for them, to help them get the wording right, that kind of thing, to help to couch the terms, the writing of their petitions in the right form of deferential language, the kind of thing you would see addressed to um, poor law courts or judicial courts by defense attorneys, that kind of thing. And some people make a great deal of this and see something sinister in it. But I think I would argue it seems to be more practical in its approach of we are in this a sense of we're in this high stakes negotiation with the state. There's a lot of potential for miscommunication, misunderstanding. Let's make sure to put our best foot forward and present the claims in a way that is likely to be most palatable to the powers that be, I suppose. So in that sense, I think an element of education of knowing how to write a respectful petition came in very handy. But in terms of actually starting the mutinies and leading the mutinies, I don't think the sailors really had any need of people coming in from outside to that extent.
I'm very conscious that we could talk for another hour on all of
Well,
this, but we will call a halt there, not least because I know listeners will
sure.
want you to come back and do an episode on what actually happened at Spithead and Nor, and
Oh,
perhass
right,
Lord
yes.
Hermione.
Oh, well, hopefully I've teased that a little bit.
Absolutely. So if you can't wait for that morsel of an episode, folks, then you can outflank us. You can jump the gun. The 1797 naval mutinies and popular protest in Britain, negotiation through collective action, is available now from Palgrave Macmillan. Callum, it's been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for your time.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. This Christmas, support the show for free by subscribing so that you never miss an episode. And if you've got a question, post it in the comments section and we'll get back to you. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much more on Patreon. Again, the link is in the description. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in early December 2025, were: in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, John Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Simon Weathers, John, Zach Johnson, Matthew Turner, Rich Payne, and Edward Gilhead. The Admirals: John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Steve Carter, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, Rob Painter, Simon T, Alex, JC Kaiser, and Graham Swidenbank. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell, Chosen Man Graham, the Yankee Eurogale Jarl Brian Sillicott, First Lord of the Treasury Ryan Diamond, Paltry Prince of Pukalani, I blatantly mispronounced that, Bob Burnham, General Alexander Suvorov, Seth Hansen, and too Jacobin to crown oneself, Dan Hazelwood. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Louis, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, stay nerdy, and as always, thank you for listening.